Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome back to my channel and to the New Aeon Agora series. Today, I'm reacting to Tucker Carlson's recent podcast, which was titled, crazily, The Occult, Kabbalah, the Antichrist newest manifestation, and how to avoid the mark of the beast. Buckle up, because this one uses a heavy dose of apocalypse porn and occult-coded fear-mongering. Carlson and his guest, writer, apparently, I wasn't able to find much about him, Conrad Flynn, frame everything through sort of like unexamined Christian fundamentalist lens, obviously, where pretty much every sort of cultural or technological change becomes proof of demonic forces at work. What they do is tossing around terms like spiritual war, Antichrist, mark of the beast, to scare the audience rather than to inform it. So let's be clear, this episode is not a bold investigation. If anything, it's a lazy mash-up of misinformation. They sell fear by draping current events in apocalyptic language. And as a reaction, we'll confront together three major problems in their narrative, and we'll try to set the record straight. First of all, their wild conflation of completely unrelated occult traditions. Second, their sloppy sourcing and misleading name drops, there are plenty of them. And third, their completely alarmist spiritual warfare framing of AI and technology. Throughout, I'll try to highlight how Carlson's narrative relies on superstition and false history instead of facts. Let's start at the beginning. The first glaring issue is how this episode conflates a grab bag of mystical and occult concept into one big, dark and scary tradition. Carl's guest name-checks Jewish Kabbalah, Hermetic Qabalah, and the Qliphoth, which is, let's say, the Kabbalah dark side for those of you who never encountered this term. He also name-checks the avant-garde CCRU theory-fiction of Nick Land. And then some, of course, for added bonus, of course, some Crowleyan Thelema, treating them as if they're all one continuous satanic conspiracy. This is both historically and spiritually wrong. There's no way around it. These terms may sound exotic or scary if you don't know them, which is obviously whoever they're talking to, their directed audience. So let's clarify a little bit. Jewish Kabbalah, written with a K, is a century-old Jewish mystical tradition focused on understanding divinity and the cosmos. It's not about demons or antichrists. It's an esoteric interpretation of the Torah. Equating Kabbalah with Satanism is absurd and very, very offensive. I wonder what a lot of Tucker Carlson's supporters will think of that. Then we have Hermetic Qabalah with the Q, and I write about it in my first book, which is the Western esoteric system that arose in Renaissance Europe, borrowing some concept from the Jewish Kabbalah, mixing them with astrology, with alchemy, and Christian mysticism. It's a syncretic offshoot, not the same as the authentic Jewish Kabbalah. And a lot of people, even in occult communities, tend to misunderstand this. Then you have the Qliphoth. In Kabbalistic lore, the Qliphoth, which is a Jewish term that means, amongst other things, shells, represents the impure and evil forces, which are essentially the shadow side of the Holy Sephiroth. Some occultists, Kenneth Grant first and foremost, later explore this tree of death or tree of night, but it's not mainstream Kabbalah at all. If you were to talk with any Jewish Kabbalists, they would scoff at these reinterpretations. And then, of course, you have Thelema. For those of you who still don't know what it is, well, welcome to my channel. That's my main topic. Thelema is the spiritual philosophy founded by Aleister Crowley, built as a modern religion, or I'd rather like to say maybe a spiritual and magical philosophy, drawing on many sources, from the Egyptian myth to Hermetic Qabalah to Christian mysticism, plenty of others. But the point that I'm making here is that Crowley was absolutely not a card-carrying Satanist, despite Carlson's offhand label. He was a ritual magician with a complex belief system, which is far too complex for Carlson's simplistic good versus evil narrative. Again, if you're curious about it, that's my main topic. I write books about it. You can find everything in the links below. you know what to do. And then the last one was interesting because you have the CCRU and Nick Land. CCRU stands for Cybernetic Culture Research Unit and was a 1990s philosophy collective led by this British professor and philosopher Nick Land. They experimented with merging occult ideas, fiction, and tech theory. They were definitely very edgy. They were doing rituals and speculating about AI as a supernatural entity. But the CCRU's work was more art than theory fiction than actual devil-worshipping cult. It's, if we want to really give it a name, it's a sort of intellectual provocation, not a proof of a century-old cabal. Again, I find it very interesting that Tucker Carlson decided to put Nick Land in this narrative of evil Satanist, preparing the arrival of the Antichrist and the imposition of the mark of the beast on all of us, because Nick Land has been very supportive of Tucker Carlson general political sides over the last 10 years. Are we maybe looking at some sort of fracturing into the MAGA regime? I don't know. It's interesting to notice, right? It's even more interesting to me is Conrad Flynn, the guest, because this guy lumps all these things together. Are there like one single dark tradition handed down from ancient Babylonians to modern AI engineers? I want to really reiterate and drive home the point. This is absolutely false. For instance, right, out of the top of my head, he claims the Babylonian Qabalah is the origin of all Western occultism, and that AI is just modern Kabbalah fulfilling the Book of Revelation. This wild thesis cherry-picks snippets from vastly different contexts and glues them together, very badly, with a sort of biblical horror story. In reality, Western occult traditions are diverse, very much so. They evolved in different eras and different cultures. Kabbalah was one influence among many, and its Jewish practitioners certainly weren't plotting to spawn an Antichrist AI. So Flynn's narrative is taking completely different puzzle pieces and forcing them into one picture. And that picture, of course, is the one of this looming satanic conspiracy. If anybody had any doubt, this is not scholarship. It's pulp fiction. I guess he should be a writer and maybe go back writing on Wear Tales or other, pulp magazines that, if there any are still around. So to put it simply, right, and try to summarize this point, Jewish mystics, Victorian magicians, and sci-fi occult philosophers are not all in the same league. By conflating them, Flynn and Carlson basically collapse important distinction. What they do is feeding a false narrative that anything labeled occult must derive from one monolithic evil source. It's the same old trick. You paint the unknown as one big devil, and then you point at it, especially knowing that your audience is likely too ignorant to know any better. So let's not fall for it. Real history is a lot more nuanced. Now let's look at the episode next big problem, and I'm laughing because it's kind of funny, to be fair. And that is its abysmal sourcing and name-dropping of expert without any context. And it's funny because I know 3 of those experts' name, and they all came out in the intervening week or so since that podcast aired by telling the world was we don't know who this guy is. So, yeah, kind of funny. So, over and over during the podcast, we hear these sweeping claims supported by anecdotes or misquotes that completely crumble under scrutiny. For instance, let's tackle the one that stood out the most for me. That is the Crowley secretary story. Carlson and Flynn really lean on this one. They say that even Aleister Crowley's secretary, which at various times they were different, but they mean Kenneth Grant, which was the last one who took that role. And so even Crowley's secretary admitted that of course rock and roll is demonic. This to them is like a gotcha moment, a proof that even an infamous occultist inner circle agrees with 1950s church pastors about the evil of rock music. I really had to stop here and, wonder if I did, I don't know, a timeline jump skip. I time traveled, because it seems like it was in the 1980s, right? And I mean, I was alive in the 1980s. I was a child, but I was like, how did we get here? How is it possible that this type of sloppy and ridiculous discourse is still mainstream 40 years later? What's funny is that they're using like Kenneth Grant, like he was a Baptist minister witnessing against rock. But here's what they conveniently omit. Kenneth Grant was not just a secretary. He became a leading occult author, as many of you watching this video will know already, and the head of a Thelemic order, the Typhonian OTO, nowadays known as the Typhonian Order. If he commented on rock's negative influence, and he did, to be fair, it likely wasn't because he thought rock bands were summoning Satan in their backrooms. More plausibly, it's that Grant was a sort of like an old-school British gentleman with a taste of jazz and classical music, and who saw rock stars destroying themselves with drugs and excesses, and thus called the scene demonic in a figurative way. And to be fair, I didn't go and double-check. I'm not even sure he did, right? What I'm sure that knowing various people that knew him directly here in London, and having corresponded with him 20 years ago for a short while, I can tell you, like, he was an older gentleman, and he didn't like modern music. That's it. That's about it. That's a far cry from, endorsing the evangelical view that rock is the devil's music. And thus, by ripping Grant's remark completely out of context, Carlson twisted into a faux evidence for his moral panic. It's ridiculous. And then we have a lot of other very, very vague name drops in the episode, the sound to sound sinister, without any proper explanation. Flynn rattles off that Silicon Valley occultism involves names like the aforementioned Kenneth Grant, Genesis Peorage, William S. Burroughs, which are all, true counterculture figures. But then they're mentioned here in a spooky ornaments rather than with any factual connections to the various tech leaders. He even brings up Hitler's interest in Kabbalah, and yes, Hitler did have interest in occult Kabbalah, implying, perhaps, that occultism is doubly evil because even Hitler picked at it. And it's interesting to me because they didn't go and mention anything about the real occultists of the Third Reich. Anyway, they do this because this is nothing but a cheap guilt by association tactic. Historical nuance is that lots of people, good and evil, have dabbled in occult ideas. It doesn't prove any conspiracy. Mentioning Hitler's library only adds shock value, not insight. Again, they're banking on the fact that they're talking to people who are just not cultured enough to know the difference. Let's look at another example. Aleister Crowley himself. Carlson calls Crowley the famous Satanist, a guy worshipping demons heavily. That's a crude caricature of Crowley's role in occult history. Crowley saw himself as a mystic, as a prophet, maybe even as the Antichrist, but in a symbolic sense. That is, he was not sacrificing goats to Satan the way, people like Carlson and maybe Flynn picture in their mind. By all accounts, Crowley's philosophy of Thelema was and is more complex than Carlson's boogeyman version. And then they either don't know or don't care about it at all. They just slaps on this Satanist level because it feeds their narrative of occult equal devil worship. This is the kind of name drop and distort approach that we all should start to recognize as morally bankrupt. And perhaps the cruelest irony is the guest, Conrad Flynn, even touts Mitch Horowitz, which is a respect occult historian and someone I call a friend, as one of his projects expert, calling Mitch a self-described Satanist. Once again, that's a gross oversimplification of Horowitz's views, because he does explore satanic symbolism philosophically, but he is not out sacrificing chickens, which is what they imply by that remark. And in fact, Mitch himself has since published a rebuttal to this episode. I'll put it in the description below. And so the takeaway here is that Carlson's themes throws around names to sound credible, but they routinely misquote or misrepresent those sources. It's all flash. There's no fact check whatsoever. When you hear them saying things like, even Crowley's inner circle thought X, or occult historian so-and-so confirms Y, be skeptical. 9 times out of 10, I would say 10 times out of 10, in fact, they've twisted the reference. It's sloppy research, it's sensational sound bites, which cannot be allowed to stand anymore in a moment like this, where this sort of satanic panic and moral panic, it's on the rise once again. Because there are people who are benefiting from it. They're making money out of it, okay? I just want to if it was not clear why this is happening. Because Tucker Carlson is making millions out of this fear. We need to cut it at the source. We need to do better information, and we need to confront all this insanity. We deserve better than occult tabloids posing as truth. And now for the grand finale of their episode, the claim that today's technology, AI, biometric IDs, digital currency, is all part of the Antichrist system. This is where Carlson fully shifts into some sort of end of times preacher mode. He and Flynn frame advances like AI as literal forces, and things like, for instance, the WorldCoin's eyeball scanning ID project as the mark of the beast come to life. This isn't just a metaphor to them, or at least that's what they're presenting. They seriously argue we are in an apocalyptic battle of good versus evil, with tech as the devil's tool. It's irresponsible fear-mongering, and they're making bank out of it. I will be honest with you, this framing may have a kernel of truth, and that is that yes, digital IDs could be misused by authoritarian system, and then, however, it drenches it in superstition. So rather than a rational critique of privacy and power, Carlson gives us a full horror movie narrative. It exploits real anxieties about AI replacing jobs, about privacy loss, by hooking them onto the emotionally charged imagery of the Antichrist. This is what Mitch Horowitz calls weaponizing superstition and false history. Horowitz, again, his rebuttal is in the link and description below, mentions that when we don't approach these topics with facts, sensationalists will happily fill the void. He says, if you do not write your own history, it gets written for you, often by people who misunderstand and or are unconcerned with the values and driving factors behind it. Mitch has really a way with words, and this is exactly what is happening here. Carlson is writing a false history of technology and occultism, turning complex developments into cheap biblical melodrama. The irony is that this kind of apocalyptic paranoia has a long track record, and it's always been wrong. In every era, there are those who cry Antichrist at whatever new thing they don't like or don't understand. Jazz and rock music, barcodes, the internet, vaccines, you name it. Someone said it was the mark of the beast. Tucker Carlson is just the latest to repackage old superstition as insight. But as the history shows, this is a distraction that keeps us from rationally grappling with real issues. AI and biotech do raise ethical questions. Absolutely. But framing them as the literal demonic fulfillments of revelation, and of course, maybe I should remind everyone that the book of Revelation, it's not about the future. It's about Emperor Nero, historian of the Bible. Dan McClellan has many videos about him, but this very thing, and I earnestly suggest you to go and watch them, because all of this does nothing to help us critically manage these technologies. It only spread fear and suspicion. So it's time to wrap this up and take stock. What we saw in Tucker Carlson Occult episode is nothing but a textbook example of fear-based storytelling triumphing over factual accuracy. The entire podcast, which is over an hour long, that I will never get back, took a bunch of disparate topics, occult traditions, rock music, AI developments, and forced them into a predetermined history. Good Christian civilization versus the hidden satanic. And it's entertaining in a lurid way, but it falls apart under basic critical examination. My reaction in one line: don't buy what they're selling. Especially because, again, they're laughing all the way to the bank about it. Again, isn't it curious that this supposedly expert writer, it has a half-assed Substack and nothing else? Oh, yes, he comes from a Hollywood family. And the implication there is that, of course, Hollywood is the new Babylon, is the center of the satanic plot. So, of course, even if this guy's a good guy, is one who escaped, is now telling us the truth, well, he knows because, his family. It's pathetic. But again, it must be working because they're doing it. And what's sad to me is that they're doing it because somehow they know that defunding schools and university for the last 40 years, since Ronald Reagan in the United States or Margaret Thatcher in the UK, let's not talk about my native Italy, which is a mess, even worse than this, but defunding instruction leads to ignorance, and ignorance makes people more corruptible, more controllable, more pliable. You can tell them any story and they'll believe it, as long as who tells the story is charismatic enough. And I'll give it to Tucker Carlson. He is a great storyteller. He's an incredibly charismatic man. But he's a liar, and a dangerous one. And I'm tired of all of this. I really hope that those of you who are watching this video, I'm pretty sure that many of you were already tuned in. But if by any chance the YouTube algorithm is serving this video to some who didn't know any better, I hope that I at least instilled a little doubt for you to go and realize that, well, the world is a little bit more complex than they make it. For the time being, that was all for me. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love and the will.